Hi, everyone. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to take everything that we've talked about, all from the dimensions of wellness and then also from the wheel of wellness, and what you kind of learned about the wheel being a well-rounded wheel is what works the best, is that we're going to really now start to establish what behavior change looks like and what is the most effective way for behavior change. So, and then we're going to walk through again a process step by step. Again, we've been building what is wellness, it's the dimensions of wellness. Well, what do these dimensions look like for you? What are the subcategories or the behaviors in these different dimensions that are important to you, and what are subcategories that you'd like to work on? So now we're going to go into a real specific process of exactly how to do that. But before we do that, I just want to give you a little bit of background on behavior change, and then we're going to go further into what this looks like for you and how to really set up a really specific plan for your own behavior change. So again, you're going to need some pens and pencils to write with. You're also going to need that investigating change document that I put in the course documents folder. So if you don't have both of those things, you need to pause the recording and go get those things again. So under the course documents link, but also the link in the module, there's a document called investigating change. So this is what it's all about in the beginning of behavior change, is investigating whether it's something that you even want to or is appropriate for you to take on right now. And so this whole beginning part of it, I'm just terming investigating change. So make sure you have that document and make sure that you have pens and pencils ready to write with. Okay, so what is behavior change? Behavior change obviously is changing something that is going to enhance your life better. And again, I don't like the words behavior change because again, it just sounds kind of judgmental to me. I kind of like more, the emphasis on enhancing behavior for your own well-being, whatever that means for you. Because again, only you know what you feel well about, and only you know what you don't feel well about. And so we spent a lot of time in the last several sessions, but especially in the last session, really looking at what that looks like. So we went over, kind of establishing different subcategories of behaviors in the different dimensions of wellness. I had you put them on a number line. What do these look like for you? And again, I was asking you to put on behaviors that are important to you, either both things that you do well and things that you would like to work on. But they need to be important to you. If they're not important to you, then why even think about it, right? And then from those number lines, what we did is we plotted them on a wheel, and the wheel is what I call the wheel of wellness. And again, for a wheel to be most functional, so for us to be most functional in our well-being, we should be balanced in. And so again, this is an integrated approach of well-being. And then from there, I asked you on that last page to kind of just talk about what some of your strengths are and really be able to highlight those and those that are important to you. But then also highlight some of the things that you might want to work on. And again, it's not about right and wrong. It's just about the things that you think that you would have a higher level of well-being if you were to be able to improve those things in your life. And then I asked you to kind of process about what specific behaviors would look like. And so I just want to leave it there, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the stages of change. And you read about this a little bit in the reading. I'm just going to give you kind of my own take for the words on, kind of the descriptions on this. Pre-contemplation is when we just even deny we want to change, or we think it's just way too big, why even try? I want to lose weight, but I wanted to lose weight forever, and every time I try, I can't do it, so why even try? So pre-contemplation is this stage where you're kind of frustrated, but you just don't feel like you have any kind of power to change it anyway, so you're just kind of disregarding it and not really thinking about it. Contemplation is when we start thinking about it, and we start thinking about, why is it important? What will I gain if I do it? I start planning it. And I start really getting specific about kind of general ideas of how it might not quite the specific plan of implementation yet, but kind of what it might look like if I were really to be able to implement this in my life. And then you go for the plan of implementation. And this, again, all these are stages. And what we know from these stages is what makes people successful is that they most often kind of go through all of these stages of change. So plan of implementation, the more specific you are about a plan of implementation, by far and large, the more likely you are to be successful at it. So making a very specific plan of implementation is really important, and we're working towards that. We're not going to do that yet because we don't want to jump over the other steps. But making a plan of implementation is super important. Then action. Action is when the change happens. If nothing changes, nothing changes, right? I say that a million times in this class. If nothing changes, nothing changes. So action is where the change happens. I've seen people that get stuck in the contemplation phase, and they think about it and think about it and plan it and plan it and plan it and never actually get out and do it. So action is really important. Nothing changes until the action stage happens. But then what happens is after the action stage happens, say I'm just going to use example of losing weight, you lose 20 pounds, you feel great, but then you got to maintain it, right? Which is a whole different ballgame because it's not as focused concentration as when you're trying to lose it in the first place, but you don't want to also just backtrack into the way that you used to be. So maintenance is a really important phase. It's its own phase, and it's a very important phase of behavior change because if it's not given attention, then a lot of relapse occurs, and a lot of behavior change programs we end up relapsing a lot. And so the maintenance stage is hugely important. Every single one of these stages is hugely important, but it's kind of important to understand that there are different stages. One of the things that I like to think about, in the maintenance stage is, number one, how do you keep that goal alive when it's not the primary focus anymore, and you need to kind of reintegrate back into doing other things as well. Sometimes when you're just totally tunnel vision focused, it's an easy thing to do. But how do you keep it between lapses and relapses? Because that's gonna happen. And, way, 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 way more behavior change is successful when you realize that lapses and relapses are going to happen most of the time. And it's much more behavior change, long-term behavior change, and life-term behavior change is way more about just, I don't know where this came from, but getting back on the horse than ever staying on the horse. In other words, some people go on a diet and then they eat a cookie and then they think they've blown it, so they eat the whole package, and then the next day they eat the whole package because they think they've blown it, and then 10 days later they're back where they started, and it's like, no, so you had a cookie. It's like you need to understand that sometimes lapses happen, and then how do you get back on the horse? Or exercise. Sometimes you get this exercise program down great, and then you get sick. And so you can't exercise for a couple days, but then it's been a couple days, and then it's like, oh, now I got a thing to study for. And, so pretty soon now the couple days has turned into a week, and now you're thinking, oh my gosh, I dropped this all and I was doing so good. It's not about that. It's just like, okay, so the week's up and I lapsed a little bit. How do I get back on it? I call that accidentally quitting. And I think it's a huge concept to understand because we always accidentally quit. In other words, it wasn't our intention to quit, but then when we just realize that's a thing, then we just have a plan to get us back motivated again. Whenever I've talked a lot about being a runner, but whenever I'm, and I, kind of go down in my laps in running as much as that I like to run, I know that it's just a thing. I've been doing it long enough that I know that there's ebbs and flows, and the thing that I need to do to get myself excited again is either sign up for a marathon, or I have a movie I always watch that inspires me, or I need to do something that I get really inspired again, change it up a little bit, decide to go on a different run somewhere. And so I know that there are things to get me motivated again, because accidentally quitting doesn't mean forever unless you let it be forever. So I just can't impress enough that accidentally quitting is part of the stages of change. And then synthesis, how do you weave that behavior into your everyday life? And so we're actually going to talk about and go through all these stages of change. Right now, what we're going to do is we're just going to really focus on the contemplation stage. And then in next week, we're going to focus on the plan of implementation. And then throughout the rest of the semester, you're actually going to take action. But right now, what we're really going to focus on is the contemplation phase. Because if you don't really plan for it, and if you don't really process why it's important and what it's going to do for you and how you would feel if you didn't do it, then it's probably not going to be enough to get you through. Or if you start a behavior change plan or a plan of implementation of something that you're excited about, and you haven't thought it through enough, and it's really not what you wanted to do in the long run, it's just going to really go on your self-esteem, because maybe you're not ready to go on that diet, or maybe you're not ready to start that exercise program. And it would be better to recognize it now than to do it for a couple days and then blow it and then hate yourself, right? So it's really important to kind of process the big questions first. Why is it important? Is it doable? How would I feel if I was successful? How would I feel if I wasn't successful? All of those things are really, really, really good input to kind of process in your own system about, okay, so this really is something that I want to do, and these are the reasons why, and this is how I'm going to feel. So that's what we're really going to focus on right now. So the steps to change, again, there's different between stages of change and then the steps to change. So the first step is plan, then enact, then measure, then maintain. And right now we're just really in the planning phase. We're just beginning to start the planning phase. In fact, we're not even really going to start the planning phase until we process why it's important first. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're really going to look at the process of the importance to us. Is it really important? Is it something that I really want to do or I really want to take on right now? So what I want you to do is I want you to go back to your wheel of wellness and go back to the last things you wrote about your strengths, and go back to the last things you wrote about kind of the things that you would like to work on, and kind of the behaviors or the everyday things that you do that focus on those things. And I want you to do two things, and we're going to split these up, but right now I want you to decide on what those two things are. I want you to pick two behaviors, so it might be exercise, or it might be nutrition, or it might be I want to focus on either just overall eating better, or I want to focus on my emotional health, and what that looks like is I want to not be so triggered when somebody talks to me, or I want to work on my communication skills, or again, I want it to be more specific. I want it to be really specific. I want to be better at keeping myself organized. I want to be, so again, I want it kind of focusing on the behavior, not the general concept. So I want you to focus on pick one that you already do well, and that you either just want to re-energize, or you want to bring it up a notch, or maybe it's kind of fallen off a little bit in COVID time. So it's something that you have a past with doing well. It might be lagging a little bit right now, but I want you to pick something that's already good. And so you've been in the maintenance phase with this thing before, but you might have been in the accidentally quitting, or you somehow you need to kind of re-energize it. So I want you to pick something like that. And again, it's just a kind of a behavior. So this is going to be a behavior change project. And this I'm going to call your maintenance behavior. Okay. And then I want you to pick one that you really want to work on. So this would be kind of on the smaller end of that wheel of wellness, something that is really important to you. And it might not be something that you feel like you're doing bad, but it's just something that you would really like to put more effort into improving. So I want you to pick that, and we're going to start with that. And that I'm going to call your challenge behavior, because it's probably one of the lower spokes or the smaller spokes on that whole wheel. So I just want you to pause the recording, and I want you to think about a couple of those. And you may need to pause the recording for a couple of days and kind of just let it process, because this is going to be a process that you're going to be really working on throughout the semester. So I want you to pause the recording as long as you need to until you can come back with two really specific ideas. One for a maintenance behavior, something that you already do pretty well, you want to re-energize, and then for another behavior that is really just a challenge behavior for you and you'd really like to put some effort into improving it. You think that your personal well-being would really be improved if you could put some effort into changing this behavior. And before you identify either of those, they both need to be something that you have full control over. So in other words, you don't want to pick a behavior change program that is based on something that you really don't have the control over. You think you might, or you think you might be able to, because then you're just setting yourself up for failure. So you really want to pick something that you have full control over right now, because if you're going to put the effort into it, you want to make sure that it's something that you can be successful with. The worst thing is that when you try to do behavior change that you're really not invested in, or you really can't do anyway, and then you set yourself up for failure, and then you just feel bad about yourself for failing. So again, a maintenance behavior, a challenge behavior that you really want to put some effort into changing, and again, this is going to go throughout the semester, and both of those are something that you should have full control over. So pause the recording, and I want you to really kind of spend some time writing those out. And if you can't do that right now, if you can't do that right now, just pause the recording and give it a day or two. Hopefully you're watching this earlier enough in the week, and really let it process, because these are the things that you're going to really focus on through a good part of the rest of the semester. Okay, so now coming back, this is the big part one here. You got to figure out why it's important to you in the first place. And so what I want you to do is I'm just going to ask you some questions, and I want you to pause the recording after every question and really give yourself, maybe 5 minutes to really get deep, not just write a sentence, but really get deep into the reasons why, and kind of give a lot of detail of how impactful it would be for you, or why it's so important to you. So the very first thing I want you to do, and again, we're gonna leave the maintenance behavior for a while. We're gonna come back to that next week. But what I want you to do right now is I just want you to pause the recording, and I want you to write why this behavior, changing this behavior, improving this behavior, why it's important to you. And again, spend some time, get kind of deep into it. It's not just a couple sentences. I want you to really spend some time and really kind of focus on why it is important to you. Okay, so now what I'd like you to do is I want you to just kind of read back over a little bit about why it's important to you, and pause a little bit. And now what I want you to do is I want you to kind of draw a line down the middle of the paper, and I want you to write down pros and cons, pros on one side and cons on the other, because there is pros and cons, and it's really important for us to realize that before we start, that there are going to be some things. If you're doing, I don't know why I'm stuck on exercise and nutrition, but some of the cons are going to be that sometimes you need to give up something that you usually like to do, or you might like to give up something that you usually like to eat, or your behaviors are going to have to change some way, or when you get triggered, you're going to have to really work on trying to figure out how to ground yourself. You're going to have to really implement some programs that about around emotional health, or you're going to have to implement say you want to do something about communication, you're going to have to pause and you're going to have to figure out, okay, how do I really implement this stuff? So there are pros and cons, right? And it's really important to be honest about that from the very beginning. The cons don't mean that you shouldn't do it, but it's important to recognize them from the beginning. Maybe you're going to find out that the cons are more than the pros and you want to pick a different behavior, and that's totally fine too. But most of the time, if we just kind of name the cons and we name what's going to be a little challenging, it's really good. And then we look at the pros and we decide we still want to do it anyway, then it's super important to just name that at the beginning. So I want you to pause the recording, and I want you to draw down the list. I want to really, give yourself 5 or 10 minutes and just really think this through of what are the pros of this behavior change? What are the cons of this behavior change? And really kind of get deep in your thought process. So pause the recording and write down what your pros and cons are. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is how I want you to really get into this narrative. How would it feel if you were successful? How would it feel? What would it look like? How would things be different? And again, I want you to really kind of imagine yourself in the scenario of doing the things, the behavior, having that behavior really kind of integrated as part of your life. How would it feel? I want you to really get into that feeling, because there's something about that feeling state that helps motivate change. We're going to talk about that later with stress management, but it really does. There's something about that embodied state of really believing something. So I want you to just kind of really get into, like, what would it look like? What would it feel like if you were successful at the behavior change? How would things be different? And again, I want you to get kind of deep into this narrative. So pause the recording, write down pretty deep into the narrative of how would you feel if you were successful? What would it look like? How would things be different? Okay, so the very last thing that we're going to do, or you're going to do, is now I want you to write a narrative about how you would feel if you weren't successful. And again, I don't want you to get into beating yourself up or anything like that, but a lot of times when people really can focus on, wow, I wanted to do this for a long time and I keep putting it in the back of my mind, but you know what? If I never did it, I would really feel bad. And really acknowledge that and why and what it would look like. So you're kind of doing the same things of how would you feel if you weren't successful? What would that look like? How would things, be different in that realm? And again, it's not about beating yourself up or anything like that, but a lot of times that really serves as a motivating factor. It's like, wow, I don't want to be stuck there anymore. I don't want to keep doing these patterns. I don't want to, whatever it is, right? I don't want to keep doing that. Well, why? How would that feel if you were just stuck in the old patterns? And I want you to get really deep into how would it feel, because the very biggest factor of whether people are successful at change behaviors or in wellness enhancing behaviors is the motivation behind it. That is absolutely, they've done all kinds of research, and the absolute number one factor of whether people are successful or not successful is the motivation. And so all of these questions are really designed to get you at a level where you're really processing your level of motivation and why and what that looks like. And so part of motivation is looking at it, if I didn't really do it, how would I feel? Because that's kind of a big motivating factor for a lot of people. So again, it's not about beating yourself up, anything like that. It's just how would you feel if you weren't? And so after you do that, what I want you to do is I want you to take these questions and I just want you to put it together in a narrative. And what you're going to do is you're going to post that. This is your reflection, right? This is your reflection on investigating change. And you're just going to put it together in one long narrative, and then you're going to turn this in as your reflection on investigating change. And then where we're going to start next week is next week you're actually going to then start really kind of planning what that behavior looks like. Okay, so you're not planning yet. This time you're just processing. You're just processing kind of what your life would look like, but you're not really actually planning the process yet. All right. So have a nice week. I hope this works well for you. Spend some time. This is meant to really be done at a deeper level. Like I said, the more motivation you get from really acknowledging this process, the more likely you are to be able to be successful.